She was pretty enough for a scullery pup, but a king does not wed his kennel. The words drifted down the marble stair like smoke, and Isolde Varn felt the mating bond in her chest tear the way a seam gives way under too much weight, sudden and silent and complete. She had been climbing toward the War Council with a folio of border reports pressed to her ribs, and now she stood frozen on the 7th step, her free hand gripping the cold banister, because the voice that had just called her a kennel pup belonged to Arden Thornwild, the Alpha King of Marrowgate, the man whose name was carved beside hers in the sacred registry of the pack. Something inside her went cold, then colder, the warmth of 2 years draining out of her like blood from an opened vein. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. She looked down at her own knuckles, white against the black iron, and she made herself breathe. The laughter above her belonged to more than one throat. There was Seraphine Dalkane, the visiting noblewoman from the Silver Hollow packs, her voice a bright silver bell of amusement. And there was Ardon's, low and indulgent, the voice he had once used only for her in the dark. Now he used it to agree that Isolde was a dog. She stayed on the stair long enough to hear the rest, because a wound must be measured before it can be dressed. The bond was a mistake of my youth, Ardan said, a wandering wolf with no bloodline and a clever tongue. I was 17 and stupid. But an Alpha King requires a queen of proven lineage. Seraphine, you were bred for a throne. Isolde was bred for nothing at all. She heard the clink of goblets. She heard Seraphine murmur something about arrangements, about severing the old bond cleanly, about the girl being sent somewhere useful. And Isolde Varn, who had spent 2 years memorizing the tax rolls of a kingdom that would not put her name on a single deed, decided in that moment that she would leave, and that when she was gone, they would learn precisely what they had thrown away. She turned on the 7th step and walked down, and no one heard her go. She did not weep in the corridor. Weeping was for later, in the dark, where it could not be used against her. Instead, she walked the servants' passage behind the tapestries, the one she had learned in her first month at Marrowgate, when she still believed that knowing a place completely was the same as belonging to it. Her boots made no sound on the worn stone. Torches guttered in their brackets, throwing her shadow long and thin against the walls, and she watched that shadow move the way a stranger might, thinking that it looked steady, thinking that it looked like a woman who had not just been unmade. The bond mark on her wrist had gone from warm gold to the ashen grey of a dead ember, and she pressed her thumb over it once, hard, as if she could push the pain back inside where it belonged. 2 years. She had come to Marrowgate, a masterless wolf, with nothing but a satchel of ledgers and a head full of numbers, and Ardan had found her in the market district, settling a dispute between 3 grain merchants who had been cheating each other for a decade. And he had laughed then too, but with delight, and he had said no one had ever balanced the Marrowgate accounts in living memory. And would she try? She had tried. She had saved the treasury from 3 separate collapses. She had renegotiated the salt tariffs with the coastal packs and doubled the crown's revenue. She had done it all without a title, without a wage that was hers to keep, because Arden said the bond made them one, and what was his was hers, and she had believed him the way you believe in the ground under your feet, right up until the ground turned to smoke. She reached the low door at the base of the passage and let herself out into the kitchen gardens, where the night air smelled of thyme and turned earth and rain that had not yet fallen. She stood among the herb beds and let herself feel it, once, the full weight of it, and then she folded the feeling small and put it away, Because grief was a thing she couldn't afford to carry and still move quickly. Somewhere above her, in the lit windows of the great hall, Seraphine Dalkane was laughing again. There was a man waiting by the garden wall, and Isolde knew who he was before she saw his face, because only one person in all of Marrowgate would stand in the dark at this hour with a lantern shuttered to a sliver of light. Old Master Corwin Ashby had been the keeper of the crown ledgers for 40 years before Isolde arrived, a stooped and silver-bearded wolf whose eyes had gone milky at the edges, but who could still recite a decade of grain yields from memory. He had been the only one who never resented her, the only one who had said, on her first day, that numbers did not care about bloodlines, and that this was the most honest thing in the world. Now he lifted the shutter of his lantern and let a thin blade of gold fall across the herb beds, and she saw that his old face was creased with something that was not quite grief, but was very close to it. "You hurt?" he said. It was not a question. "I heard," she answered, and her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that, in a distant, clinical way. Corwin nodded slowly. "I have been listening to that woman for a fortnight," he said, whispering in the young fool's ear. "She did not come to Marrowgate for a marriage, child. She came for the salt roots and the eastern mines and the treasury you built with your own 2 hands. Arden thinks he is choosing a queen. He is opening the gate to a wolf who will eat him alive." Isolde looked at the old man for a long moment. "Then let her," she said quietly. "It is not my treasury. It was never my treasury. They made that very clear." Corwin's mouth tightened. "It could have been," he said. "You did the work of 10 stewards and they gave you a bond mark and called it payment. That was theft, whatever the law says." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded packet of oilcloth, and he pressed it into her hands, and it was heavier than it looked. "Go now," he said. "Before the severing rite. Once she has them perform it, you will be a masterless wolf again, and the law will not protect you. Go tonight. While you are still, in the eyes of the crown, the king's bonded mate with the right to walk out the front gate unchallenged." Isolde unfolded the oilcloth in the sliver of lantern light, and understood that Corwin Ashby had been preparing this for longer than she had known she would need it. Inside lay a purse, heavy with silver coin, honest coin, not crown minting that could be traced, and a sheaf of documents in the old steward's careful hand. "What is this?" she breathed, and Corwin's milky eyes crinkled. "That," he said, "is 3 years of my salary, which I never had reason to spend, an old man with no children and no debts. And these papers are the mineral survey of the Grenifer Reach, the wild land north of the river that the Crown has never bothered to claim because everyone believes it is barren. It is not barren. I surveyed it myself 40 years ago, before my eyes went. There is copper there, and something better than copper, and no one alive but me knows it, because the report was filed and forgotten, and I removed it from the archive last spring when I first began to smell the rot in this court." Isolde stared at him. "You have been planning my escape for a year," she said. "I have been planning something," Corwin corrected gently. "I did not know it would wear your face. But I am an old man, child, and I have watched 3 kings squander what wiser people built, and I decided that before I died, I would put a good tool into a good hand and see what it made. You are the good hand. The Grenifer Reach is the tool. What you build with it is yours, entirely yours, and no bond mark and no king can touch it, because it will be founded on land no crown has claimed, and coin no crown can trace." She closed her fingers over the oilcloth packet. Above them, A horn sounded from the great hall, the long, low note that summoned the pack to witness a rite, and Isolde understood that the severing had already been ordered, that even now they were preparing the sacred fire that would burn her name out of the registry. She looked up at the lit windows one last time. "Will you be safe?" she asked, "when they find the survey gone?" Corwin laughed, a dry rustle like autumn leaves. "I am 81 years old and half blind, and I have served 4 decades, he said. "They will not suspect the doddering ledger-keeper, and if they do, let them. Some debts are worth paying. Now go, Isolde Varn. Go north, and do not look back, and do not let anyone ever again convince you that you were bred for nothing." She left Marrowgate through the front gate, exactly as Corwin had said she should, walking past the guards with the folio of border reports still tucked under her arm, as though she were on the king's business, because in a sense she was, for the last time. The guards inclined their heads to the king's bonded mate and let her pass into the night. She did not stop at her chambers. She did not gather her fine gowns or the jewels Ardan had draped on her at feasts, the pearl comb, the twisted gold cuff, the ring he had slid onto her finger the night the bond first bloomed. Those things she left arranged upon her pillow in a neat and deliberate row, the ring on top, catching the moonlight through the window, a small, still life of everything she was returning. Let them find it. Let Seraphine wonder why the discarded girl had not even taken the ring to sell. Let her never quite understand that some things are refused precisely because they were offered as payment for a soul. Isolde walked out into the sleeping city with a satchel of ledgers, a purse of honest silver, a mineral survey worth a kingdom, and a bond mark going cold on her wrist, and she walked north along the river road until the towers of Marrowgate sank behind the hills, and there was nothing ahead of her but the dark shoulders of the Grennifer Reach against a sky just beginning to pale. Somewhere behind her, in a hall full of witnesses, a sacred fire was burning her name to ash. She did not feel it go out. She had already let it go. The world outside remained ignorant of what it had just lost, and Isolde Varn, masterless and unmade, and utterly, dangerously free, began to walk faster. 6 months later, the mining settlement of Grennifer Reach did not appear on any map that the Crown of Marrowgate possessed, and this was precisely how Isolde Varn wanted it. She stood on a scaffold of raw pine timber 100 feet above the valley floor, a rolled survey in one hand and a lump of blue-green ore in the other, watching the 3rd smelter come to life below her, its chimney breathing a thin banner of smoke into a hard, bright morning. She had cut her hair short in the first month, when it kept catching in the winch ropes, and she had traded her court silks for wool and leather and a heavy canvas coat, and her hands, which had once turned only pages, were now calloused across the palms and stained at the cuticle with the residue of 100 small tasks. She looked nothing like the girl on the 7th step. She looked, one of her miners had said, like something the mountain had made, rather than something that had come to it. The blue-green ore was the something better than copper that Corwin had promised. It was called celestone in the old texts, and when it was refined, it yielded a metal that was lighter than iron and stronger than bronze, and it held an edge that would not dull, and the coastal packs and the eastern smiths and the shipwrights of the southern deltas would pay in gold, in land, in favors, for as much of it as she could dig. In 6 months, she had gone from a woman sleeping in a canvas tent to a woman who employed 200 souls, most of them the discarded of other packs, the masterless, the exiled, the ones who had been told they were bred for nothing. She had a rule, and the rule was simple. At Grennifer Reach, no one asked your bloodline, and everyone earned a wage that was theirs, honest coin in an honest hand, and it was written down in a ledger that anyone could read. She had built the thing she had never been given. The confidant who climbed the scaffold to stand beside her was a woman named Bex Harrow, and she was everything the court of Marrowgate would have found unforgivable, which was to say she was competent, blunt, and entirely uninterested in whose blood ran in whose veins. Bex had been a caravan master before a broken contract left her stranded and penniless in the border towns, and she had walked into Grenifer Reach in the second month asking for work, and Isolde had watched her reorganize the ore-hauling routes in a single afternoon and had hired her before sundown. Now Bex ran the logistics of the entire operation, and she took a grim professional pleasure in it. "The southern buyers doubled their order," she said, handing Isolde a folded slate covered in her cramped tallying. "And a factor came up from the coast, asking whether we'd sell to Marrowgate directly. I told him we don't sell to Marrowgate at all." Isolde's mouth curved just slightly. "You told him that?" "I told him our founder has a policy," Bex said. "I didn't say what it was. Let them wonder." She glanced sideways at Isolde, and there was a shrewdness in her that missed very little. "You never talk about them," she said. "The place you came from. Whoever it was that put that look in your eye when a certain name gets mentioned." Isolde turned the lump of Celestine over in her hand. "There's nothing to say," she answered. "They chose someone else. I chose myself. That's the whole of it." But it was not the whole of it, and Bex knew it, and Isolde knew that she knew. The truth was that Isolde had a second ledger, one that Bex hadn't seen, and in it she kept a different kind of accounting. Not of coin, of consequences. She had spent 6 months building an empire, yes, but she had also been listening, because the border towns were full of traders who came from Marrowgate, and traders talk, and a woman who says little hears a great deal. What Isolde heard over those 6 months was the sound of a kingdom quietly coming apart. Seraphine Dalkane had married Ardon Thornwild in a ceremony of blinding extravagance 3 weeks after Isolde left, and she had immediately begun to do exactly what Corwin Ashby had predicted. She had brought her own advisors from Silverhollow, wolves with soft voices and sharp appetites, and she had installed them over the treasury that Isolde had built, and within 2 months they had begun to dismantle it. They did not understand the salt tariffs, so they raised them, and the coastal packs, insulted, took their trade elsewhere. They did not understand the grain reserves, so they sold them for quick coin, and when the autumn came dry and thin, there was nothing set aside. They looked at the careful web of debts and favors and long agreements that Isolde had spent 2 years weaving, and because they could not read it, they cut it, thread by thread, and called the cutting reform. The treasury that had been the envy of 6 packs began to hemorrhage, and Ardan, who had married a woman for her proven lineage, discovered slowly, and then all at once, that lineage did not balance an account, that a queen bred for a throne could not tell a surplus from a deficit, that the woman he had called a kennel pup had been the single load-bearing pillar of his entire reign. Isolde heard all of this in fragments, from traders and factors, and the occasional exhausted Marrowgate official come north to buy Celestine under a false name, and she wrote none of it in her ledger of coin. She wrote it in the other book, the quiet one, and she felt, each time, not triumph, but a cold and patient satisfaction, the feeling of a woman watching a debt come due entirely on its own, without her having to lift a hand. She could have moved against them. That was the thing Bex did not understand, the thing that Isolde kept folded away with all the other things she didn't say. She could have flooded the market with cheap Celestine and shattered what remained of Marrowgate's arms trade. She could have bought up the debts the Crown was defaulting on and called them all at once. She could have sent a single letter to the coastal packs revealing that the woman who had once negotiated their favorable tariffs was alive and building an empire in the north, and half of them would have abandoned Marrowgate on principle within a week. She had considered each of these things, turned them over in the long, cold evenings, and set each of them down, because cheap revenge was still cheap, and she had not walked north to become a smaller version of the people who had thrown her away. She was playing a longer game, and the shape of it had come clear to her slowly. She did not want to burn Marrowgate. She wanted to make it need her. She wanted Arden Thornwild to arrive, someday, at her gate, humbled and desperate, having exhausted every other option, and she wanted him to ask her for help, and she wanted him to look into her face and only then understand who he was asking. That was the checkmate she was building toward, patient move by patient move, and it required her to do nothing but grow stronger and let his world grow weaker, which was exactly what was happening. So she said none of this to Bex. She only rolled the survey closed and looked out over the smoking valley, over the thing she had built from a forgotten scrap of paper and an old man's 40-year secret. And she said, "Double the guard on the North Road. When Marrowgate finally comes, I want to hear about it before they reach the gate." Bex frowned. "You think they'll come?" "I think," said Isolde, "that they have nowhere else left to go. They just don't know it yet." The news that changed everything came in the deep cold of the following winter, carried by a half-frozen rider who had pushed his horse near to death up the North Road, and it was not the news that Isolde had expected. She had expected, eventually, an official delegation, a formal request, the machinery of a failing state grinding its way to her door. What arrived instead was a single old man wrapped in a caravan blanket, half conscious in the saddle, his silver beard rimed with frost, and when Bex's guards lifted him down and Isolde saw the milky, sightless eyes, she was across the courtyard before she knew she had moved. "Corwin," she said, and her voice cracked on the word for the first time in 18 months, because there was warmth she had folded away so long ago that she had almost forgotten she owned it, and it came flooding back now at the sight of the old steward's ruined face. They carried him inside to the fire in her own quarters, and she stripped the frozen blanket from him and wrapped him in dry wool and forced hot broth between his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. And it was a long hour before Corwin Ashby could speak, and when he did, his voice was a thread. "They found the survey gone," he said. "This spring. The Silverhollow advisors. They went through the whole archive looking for anything that might be sold, and they found the gap where the Grenifer report should have been, and they knew someone had taken it, and they knew I was the only one who ever touched those shelves." Isolde's hand went still on the ladle. "They questioned me," Corwin continued, and something in the flat way he said it told her more than the words did. "For a long time, I told them nothing. I am an old man and half blind, and I gave them a doddering fool who could not remember what he had for breakfast, and after a while they believed it, or believed it enough. But Seraphine did not believe it. She had them turn me out. 81 years of service, and she had me put through the gate with the clothes on my back and told the guards that any pack who took me in would answer to Marrowgate." He turned his sightless eyes toward the sound of her breathing. "I have been walking the border towns since the thaw, Isolde, trading old man's stories for a night by a fire. And everywhere I went I heard the same thing. A woman in the north. An empire out of nothing. Celestine, they said, though none of them knew the word for it. only that a masterless wolf was making the coastal packs rich and would not sell a single ingot to the crown that had cast her out. I did not need to be told your name. I knew it the moment I heard the story, so I came to find out if the good tool was still in the good hand. Isolde set down the ladle very carefully. You lost everything, she said, for me. I lost nothing, Corwin said, and he smiled, and his cracked lips split, and he did not seem to care. I gave a survey to a woman who deserved it. Everything after that was mine to spend as I liked, and I would spend it again. She gave him her own bed and a room with a window facing the smelters, because he liked the sound of the works even if he could no longer see them, and she gave him the thing he had never had at Marrowgate, which was rest without the constant low fear of being deemed useless. But Corwin Ashby was not a man built for rest, and within a fortnight of his strength returning, he had appointed himself the keeper of Grennifer Reach's ledgers, sitting by the fire with a young clerk reading the tallies aloud while he corrected them from memory, catching errors no one else could see. Isolde let him. She understood the need to be of use. It was the same need that had driven her north with a satchel and a survey, and in the long evenings, when the works had gone quiet and the valley was blue with cold, Corwin told her the rest of what he had learned in the border towns, and it was worse than she had known. Marrowgate was not merely mismanaged now. It was dying. The autumn had been thin and the winter was hard, and the grain reserves Isolde had spent 2 years building were gone, sold off by advisers who did not understand what they were for, and the common wolves of the outer districts were beginning to starve. Seraphine's Silverhollow relatives had been given the most profitable posts, and had bled them dry and sent the profits home across the mountains, so that even the wealth that remained was leaving the kingdom in a steady, quiet trickle. And Arden Thornwild, the AlphaKing, had discovered too late that he had married not a partner, but a parasite with a whole family of parasites behind her. And he had begun, Corwin said, to look like a man in a house whose foundations were being carried away in the night. He knows, Corwin said one evening, staring into the fire he could not see. He knows what he did. That is the thing about a man like Arden. He is not stupid, only proud, and pride does not survive a starving winter. He has begun to speak your name again, they say. Not with contempt, with something else. Isolde was quiet for a long time. It doesn't matter what he speaks, she said at last. The bond is severed. The registry is ash. I am nothing to Marrowgate now. You are the only thing that could save it, Corwin said gently, and I think, before the spring, he will realize that too. The realization, when it came, took a form Isolde had not predicted, and it came faster than even Corwin had guessed. In the last hard weeks of winter, when the passes were still choked with snow, a delegation from Marrowgate came up the North Road at last. But it was not the desperate king she had imagined, and it was not a formal request for aid. It was Seraphine Dalkane's own adviser, a smooth-faced Silverhollow wolf named Halvard Crane, and he did not come to beg. He came to buy, and he came to threaten, and he came, Isolde understood the moment he was ushered into her hall, with no idea whatsoever who she was. He had never seen her. He had come to Marrowgate after she left. He knew her only as a name on a burned registry, if he knew her at all. He saw a woman in wool and leather with short-cropped hair and calloused hands, standing behind a plain table in a hall built of raw pine and river stone, and he made the same mistake that everyone at Marrowgate had once made, the mistake of measuring worth by its trappings. "I'll speak with your master," Halvard Crane said, unwinding his fine fur collar and looking about the room as though pricing it. "The one who owns this operation. I don't have time for stewards." Bex Harrow, standing by the wall, made a small sound in her throat, but Isolde stilled her with a glance. "You're speaking with her," Isolde said. Halvard Crane looked at her again, and a flicker of doubt crossed his smooth face, quickly smoothed over. "You own the Grennifer works," he said. "I founded them," said Isolde. "Then let me be plain," he said, recovering his condescension like a dropped glove. "The crown of Marrowgate requires Celestine, and a great deal of it. Your operation has been an irritation, selling to every pack but ours. That ends now. You will sign a contract of exclusive supply to the Crown at a price the Crown will set, and in exchange the Crown will refrain from asserting its ancient claim to all mineral rights north of the river, a claim which, I remind you, would render this entire settlement an illegal occupation of royal land." He set a rolled document on her plain table with the air of a man laying down a winning hand. Isolde did not touch the document. She looked at it, and then she looked at Halvard Crane, and something moved behind her eyes that was very old and very cold and had been waiting a long time for a night exactly like this one. "The Crown of Marrowgate," she said slowly, "has never claimed the land north of the river. It appears on no royal survey. It is listed in no charter. The Crown believes it barren, and has believed so for 40 years, because the only survey that proved otherwise was removed from the archive and has been in my possession the entire time." Halvard Crane's smooth face went carefully blank. "You cannot prove—" "I can prove everything," Isolde said. "I have the original survey, filed and sealed in the hand of the Crown's own steward of 40 years, dated and witnessed. I have the assay records of every ingot I've refined. I have the bills of sale to 9 separate packs, all of them documenting that Grennifer Reach has operated openly for 2 years, while the Crown of Marrowgate did nothing, said nothing, and claimed nothing. There is a word for a right you never assert and never record and never defend, Master Crane. The word is abandoned. You have no claim here. You never did. And I think you know it, or you would have brought a magistrate instead of a bluff." She let the silence sit. Halvard Crane's jaw worked. "The Crown," he said, and his voice had lost its silk, "is prepared to be generous." "The Crown," Isolde said, "is prepared to starve. I know how thin your reserves are. I know your grain is gone, and your tariffs are ruined, and your best advisors are sending Marrowgate's wealth home to Silverhollow one caravan at a time. I know all of it, Master Crane, because half the traders who come to my gate come from your dying kingdom and traders talk. You did not come here to negotiate. You came here because Grennifer Celestine is the only asset within reach that could refill the treasury you emptied, and you hoped a mountain steward would be too ignorant to know her own worth." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped, and it was the quietest thing in the room and the most dangerous. "That is a mistake that a great many people have made about me. It has never once ended well for them." Halvard Crane left before nightfall, without a contract, without a threat that had survived contact with her, and with the beginnings of a suspicion, Isolde thought, watching him ride south into the snow, that the woman he had underestimated was not merely a canny mountain trader. He would report back. He would describe her. And somewhere in the cold halls of Marrowgate, someone who had known her face might hear that description and go very still. She found that she did not mind. The long game she had been playing had always assumed this moment would come. She had only expected it later, and softer. Now it would come hard and fast, on the heels of a delegation that had failed in the middle of a starving winter, and she would be ready. She summoned Bex and Corwin to her fire that night and laid it out for them plainly. "They'll come again," she said. "Not with an advisor next time. The Crown is out of options and out of time, and when Crane tells them there's a fortune in metal 100 miles north that they cannot bully or claim, Arden will have to come himself, because a king cannot send a servant to beg. Corwin nodded slowly by the fire. And when he comes, he said, he will see your face. Yes, said Isolde. Bex looked between them, reading the weight in the room, understanding at last the shape of the thing Isolde had never spoken of. This king, she said carefully. He's the one whose name puts that look in your eye. Isolde was quiet. Then she said, he called me a kennel pup. He said I was bred for nothing. He burned my name out of the registry and married a woman for her bloodline, and then he handed her his kingdom, and she fed it to her family, piece by piece, while his people starved. She looked into the fire. I did not build this place for revenge, Bex. I want you to understand that. I built it because I refused to be nothing. But I would be lying if I said I hadn't imagined the moment he stands where Halvard Crane stood tonight and asks me for help, and only then understands who he's asking. Bex was silent for a moment. Then grimly, good, she said. Let him understand it all the way down. They came in the last week of winter, when the passes had barely opened, and Bex's scouts on the North Road brought word 2 days ahead, exactly as Isolde had arranged so long ago. It was a small party, which told her much. A king who came to beg does not come with an army, because an army is a thing you bring when you still believe you have power, and Arden Thornwild no longer believed it. 6 riders. The king, 2 guards, a herald, and 2 figures Isolde could not immediately place from the scout's description, one tall and one that rode like nobility. She had time to prepare, and she used it, but not in the way she might have once imagined. She did not put on finery to shame him. She had none, and would not have worn it if she had. She wore her wool and her leather, and her calloused hands and her short cropped hair, because those were the truth of what she had become, and she wanted him to see the truth. She did, however, receive him in the great hall of Grenifer Reach, which she had built wide and high with a long table down its centre, and a tall chair at the head of it, turned to face the fire, its back to the door, and she sat in that chair with a ledger open before her, and she didn't turn around when they entered. She heard the doors open. She heard the stamp of cold boots, and the murmur of her own people falling silent along the walls, and she heard Bex's voice, flat and formal, announcing that the founder of Grenifer Reach would receive the visitors, and still she did not turn. She let the silence stretch. She let Arden Thornwild, AlphaKing of Marrowgate, stand in the hall of the woman he had cast out and wait upon her pleasure, exactly as she had once waited upon his on a marble stair. Then, slowly, she turned the chair. She watched his face as it happened, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. Arden had aged a decade in 18 months. The pride that had once sat on him like a crown had thinned to something haggard and haunted. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes ringed, and he wore the exhaustion of a starving winter like a second cloak. He had been looking at the ledger, at the long table, at the trappings of an empire, formulating whatever half-humbled speech a proud man rehearses on a hard road. And then the chair turned, and he saw her face, and every word he had prepared died in his throat. She watched the recognition arrive in stages, disbelief first, then denial, then a dawning horror that was almost too large for his face to hold. "Isolde," he said, and it came out broken. Beside him, the tall figure went rigid, and Isolde saw now that it was Seraphine Dulcane, thinner than she remembered, her fine gown out of place among the pine and stone, her silver bell voice nowhere in evidence. Seraphine had come to see what her adviser had failed to secure, and she was staring at Isolde with the particular fury of a woman who has just understood that the game she thought she'd won was never the game being played. "You," Seraphine breathed. "You're the founder. You're the one who won't sell." Isolde looked at her, and then past her, dismissing her as easily as she had once been dismissed, and returned her gaze to Ardon. "Sit," she said, and gestured to the long table, and it was not an invitation. It was the calm instruction of someone who owned the room, the road, the mountain, and every ingot in it. And Arden Thornwild, Alpha King of Marrowgate, sat, because he had nothing left with which to refuse. "You've come a long way," Isolde said, "for a woman who was bred for nothing." She saw the words land, saw him flinch as his own judgment came back to him across 18 months and 100 cold miles. He opened his mouth, and she raised a single hand, and he stopped, and the ease with which she silenced a king was not lost on anyone in the hall. "Let me save you the speech," she said. "You are starving. Your treasury is gone. The tariffs I built are broken, and the reserves I set aside are sold, and the woman you chose for her bloodline has been feeding your kingdom to her family since the day you burned my name. You have exhausted every option, and Celestine is the only asset in 100 miles that could refill your treasury and arm your smiths and buy back your people's loyalty before the spring floods bring famine. You cannot claim my land, because you never bothered to. You cannot bully me, because your advisor already tried and left with nothing. So you have come yourself to ask. And you did not know, until the chair turned, that the person you would have to ask is me." Ardan's hands were flat on the table, and they were shaking, and she saw the moment he stopped trying to be a king. "Isolde," he said again, and this time it was not disbelief, but something raw. "I was wrong. I have never in my life been so wrong. I let them poison me against you. I let my pride—" "Stop!" she said, not sharply, but with a finality that closed the subject like a door. "I don't need your confession. I have your consequences. They've told me everything the confession would." She folded her hands on the ledger. "Here is what will happen. I am going to help Marrowgate, because in Marrowgate there are common wolves who did nothing to me and who will die if I turn you away. And I did not build a place that turns away the starving. But I will not help you. I will help them. And I will do it on my terms, in writing, witnessed, and there will be no bond and no crown and no debt of gratitude you can ever call upon." She slid a document across the long table, a document Corwin had helped her draft over 3 long evenings, and Ardan's eyes moved down it and widened as he understood its scope. Grenifer Reach would supply grain from its own reserves, and Celestine at a fair price, enough to carry Marrowgate through to harvest and to rearm its smiths. In exchange, the Crown would formally and permanently cede all claim to the land north of the river, sign a trade charter that bound Marrowgate to fair tariffs with the coastal packs forever, and, in a clause Isolde had written last, and read twice to be sure of its coldness, immediately expel every Silver Hollow advisor from every Crown post, seize the wealth they had funneled home, and bar Seraphine Dalkane's family from any position of trust in the kingdom for 3 generations. "You're asking me to gut my own court," Ardan said. "I'm asking you to remove the wolves who ate it," Isolde said. "The court is already gutted, Ardan. You just haven't looked closely enough to see the bones." Seraphine surged forward then, her composure finally shattering. "You can't sign this," she hissed at Ardan. "This masterless, this... she'll ruin my family, she'll—" "Your family," Isolde said, and now, only now, did she turn the full cold weight of her attention on Seraphine Dulcane. Has spent 18 months looting a starving kingdom. Your advisors raised the tariffs that broke the coastal trade. Your relatives sold the grain that would have fed the outer districts this winter. You didn't come to Marrowgate for a marriage or a crown. You came for the treasury I built, and you devoured it. And now there is nothing left to devour, and you have discovered that a bloodline doesn't fill an empty granary. She let that hang. You called me a scullery pup once, in a hall full of people, and you laughed. I heard you. I stood on the stair, and I heard both of you laugh. She saw Ardon close his eyes. I did not build this empire to make you pay for that laugh. But I confess I am not sorry that paying for it is where you've ended up. Seraphine had no answer, because there was none, and Isolde watched the woman's fury curdle into something Yasmoala and uglier, the recognition of a gambler who has bet everything on a card that was never in the deck. She turned to Ardon, expecting perhaps that he would defend her, that whatever thread had bound them would hold. But Ardon Thornwild didn't look at his queen. He looked at the document on the table, and then he looked at Isolde, and the last of the king in him seemed to understand that there was only one path left that did not end in the death of his people. He reached for the pen. "Ardon," Seraphine said, and there was panic in it now. "Ardon, look at me." He did not. He read the document a second time, slowly, the way a man reads a sentence being passed on him, and then he dipped the pen, and he signed his name at the bottom, the full formal signature of the Alpha King of Marrowgate, and beside it Corwin Ashby, who had shuffled forward from his place by the fire, pressed the Crown Steward's seal that he had carried north in his coat, the last authentic seal of Marrowgate's treasury, and witnessed it in a hand that had recorded 4 decades of that kingdom's history. Seraphine watched the seal come down on the wax and made a sound that was not quite a word. "That's my life," she said. "That's my family's." "That," said Corwin Ashby, lifting his sightless eyes toward the sound of her voice, "is a ledger balancing, child. I have spent 40 years watching them balance. They always do. It only takes longer than the guilty would like." And Isolde understood, watching the old man press the seal, that this had been his moment as much as hers. The doddering ledger-keeper who had been turned out of his own gate having the final word on the account. Ardon set down the pen and looked at her across the table, and for a moment the hall was very quiet, and the fire cracked, and Isolde saw in his ruined face the thing she had once imagined she wanted, which was regret, complete and total, and far too late. "It could have been you," he said quietly. "The Queen. All of this could have been ours together. I threw it away." Isolde considered him for a long moment. She thought of the marble stair, and the mating bond tearing, and the ring left on the pillow catching the moonlight. She thought of the 2 years of work that had earned her a bond mark and a title of nothing, and the way she had believed, right up to the 7th step, that being needed was the same as being valued. "No," she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a clarity that had cost her everything and been worth every coin. "It could never have been ours, Ardon, because you would always have known, somewhere underneath, that I came to you with nothing and could be sent back to nothing, and that knowledge would have poisoned everything, the way it always poisons a thing built on unequal ground. This," she gestured at the hall, "the ledger, the 200 souls who worked her mountain. This is mine. I built it. No one gave it to me and no one can take it away. And that is the difference between what I have now and what you offered me then. You offered me a cage and called it a throne. I would rather have a mountain I dug myself." She rose from the tall chair. "The grain will move south within the week. The Celestine will follow. Your people will not starve. Honor the charter, and we will trade fairly for a generation. Break it, and I will let the coastal packs know exactly who broke it, and you will find that a king without allies and without a treasury is a very short-lived thing." She looked at Seraphine one last time. "Go home," she said. "There's nothing left for you here. There never was. You just mistook a treasury for a birthright, and now the treasury is gone." They left the way they had come, 6 riders on a cold road, though they left lighter in one sense and far heavier in another, and Isolde stood on the steps of the hall she had built and watched them dwindle into the white distance until the north road swallowed them. Bex came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You let them off easy," Bex said at last, though there was no reproach in it, only a caravan master's professional assessment. "You could have broken him, flooded the market, called his debts, told the coastal packs he was finished. He'd have been picking through the ruins by summer." "I know," Isolde said. "Why didn't you?" Isolde watched the last of the riders vanish. "Because breaking him would have meant becoming him," she said. "A person who takes because they can, who measures their worth by what they've ruined. I spent 18 months proving I was more than what he said I was. If I'd ended it by burning his kingdom down, I'd have proved him right instead. He said I was bred for destruction, for nothing, for a kennel. So I built something that feeds 200 families and will feed his starving people through the winter, and I did it without him, and I let him watch me do it. That's not mercy, Bex. Mercy is when you spare someone out of softness. This is something else. I spared him because sparing him was the strongest thing I could do, and because I wanted him to have to live inside the knowledge of it for the rest of his reign." She turned back toward the warmth of the hall. "Let him rule his rescued kingdom, knowing that a scullery pup pulled it out of the fire. That's a heavier sentence than any I could have signed." Corwin Ashby lived 4 more years at Grenifer Reach, keeping the ledgers by memory and correcting the young clerks with a smile, and he died in his sleep in a room that faced the smelters he could hear, but never see. An old man who had put a good tool into a good hand and lived to watch what it made. Isolde buried him on the ridge above the valley, where the wind carried the sound of the works up to him, and she had a stone cut with words that were not his name and not his title, but the only thing he had ever wanted, said of him. He kept the account honest. The empire grew. The coastal packs signed the fair charter and grew rich alongside her, and the eastern smiths made Celestine blades that were spoken of in packs Isolde had never seen, and the masterless, and the exiled, and the ones who had been told they were bred for nothing, kept coming up the north road, and she gave them wages that were theirs, and names in a ledger anyone could read, and slowly the thing she had built stopped being a settlement and became a place, a name on maps that the crown of Marrowgate had once pretended didn't exist. Marrowgate itself recovered, slowly, chastened, its Silver Hollow parasites expelled, and its treasury rebuilt on the fair trade Isolde had bound it to. Arden Thornwild ruled it for many years, and he ruled it better. Humbled men often do, and he never married again, and he never once broke the charter. And Isolde heard, from the traders who still talked, that he kept a copy of the document he had signed framed on the wall of his council chamber, where every adviser who ever counseled him could see the name of the woman who had saved a kingdom she owed nothing to, Seraphine Dalkane returned to Silverhollow in disgrace, her family stripped of the wealth they had stolen, and she faded from the stories the traders told, which was, Isolde thought, exactly the fate a hollow thing deserved. Not punishment, but simply to be forgotten, to discover that without a treasury to attach herself to, she was nothing anyone thought worth speaking of. Isolde Varn never went back to Marrowgate. She was asked once, years later, when the old wounds had scarred over and the kingdom had grown grateful, whether she would come and be honored at the court that had cast her out, and she declined with a single line that the herald carried back, and that became, in time, a proverb in the border towns. "Duty calls me elsewhere," she said, "Your Majesty." She did not need their honor. She had her mountain and her ledger, and her 200 families grown to 2,000, and she had the bond mark on her wrist that had gone from gold to ash, and had, over the long years, faded to nothing at all, a pale, unmarked skin where a king's claim had once burned, and she found that she liked it that way, unclaimed, unowned, hers. She married eventually, though not for status and not for a crown. She married a metallurgist from the Eastern Smiths, who came north to learn the Celestine trade, and stayed because he loved the way she read a room, and the way she read a ledger, and the way she would not be commanded. A man who respected her competence before he ever noticed her rank, which by then was considerable. They had no bond mark, because Isolde would never again wear a mark that could be burned, and it did not matter, because what they had was chosen fresh each morning and written in no registry, and that, she had learned, was the only kind of bond worth keeping. She lived a long time. She grew old on her mountain, and on the clear, cold evenings she would sometimes climb to Corwin's stone on the ridge and sit with the sound of the works rising up from the valley, the empire an old man's forgotten survey had made possible, and she would think about the girl on the 7th step who had heard herself called a kennel pup, and had not screamed, had not begged, had only turned and walked down the stair and out the gate and north into the dark, carrying nothing that had been given to her and everything that mattered. Because that was the truth she had learned, the truth she had built with her own calloused hands, and would have carved on every stone if she could. Worth is not granted by those in power. It cannot be bestowed by a king, or burned out of a registry, or laughed away on a marble stair. It is not a title someone hangs on you, to be taken back when a better offer comes along. It is proven in the cold and the dark and the years of grinding work, and it is reclaimed on your own terms, and once you have built it yourself, no one on this earth can take it from you, because they never gave it to you in the first place. Ardan Thornwild had believed that a queen's value came from her bloodline, and he had lost a kingdom learning otherwise. Seraphine Dalkane had believed that power could be inherited and stolen and worn like a borrowed gown, and she had faded into nothing when the gown was taken away. But Isolde Varn, the masterless wolf, the scullery pup, the woman bred for nothing, had understood the thing they never would. That true strength is not inherited and cannot be bought, that it is built, plank by plank, and ingot by ingot, and honest coin by honest coin, and that the people who tell you what you are worth are almost never the people who decide it. She had decided it herself. She had walked out of a gilded cage with a satchel and a secret and a going cold bond, and she had built an empire in the wild north where no crown could reach, and when the man who discarded her finally came crawling to her gate, she had not needed to raise her voice or lift her hand. She had only needed to turn the chair. If this story moved you, if you felt that 7th step silence turned slowly into a mountain, then take a moment, before you go. Give this video a like, because it tells the channel that stories like this one, stories about the quietly underestimated finding their own strength, are the stories you want more of. Share it with someone in your life who needs the reminder tonight. Someone who has been told they were bred for nothing. Someone standing on their own marble stair right now with a bond tearing in their chest, because a story can be a lantern held out in the dark by an old man who believes in you, and your share might be exactly that lantern for someone who needs one. Subscribe and join this community of people who believe that vindication, served cold, is the sweetest kind of all, that worth is built and not granted, that the strongest thing a wronged person can do is walk out the gate and become something no one can command. And tell me in the comments, because I truly want to know, was Isolde right to spare him and let him live inside what he'd lost? Or would you have flooded the market and watched Marrowgate burn? There's no wrong answer, only the kind of justice you carry in your own chest. Come find out how the next one ends. Duty calls us elsewhere, but there is always another story waiting up the North Road. The story might have ended there, on the ridge with the old man's stone and the sound of the works rising through the cold, and for many years Isolde believed it had. But there is a coda to every empire, a final entry in the ledger that no one thinks to write until the account is nearly closed, and hers came on an ordinary autumn morning, when a rider she did not recognize came up the North Road, bearing a letter sealed with a crest she had not seen in 2 decades. It was from Ardon. He was dying. The traders had carried the news ahead of the letter, as traders always did, and Isolde had heard it the way she heard everything, quietly, with a stillness that gave nothing away. The AlphaKing of Marrowgate was old now, older than his years, worn thin by the long, humbled decades of ruling the kingdom he had nearly ruined, and his healers had told him plainly that he would not see the winter. And so he had written, in a hand that shook so badly, the young rider had waited 3 days for the king to finish it, a single page that Isolde read alone by her fire, while the metallurgist she had married slept in the next room. He did not beg. That was the first thing she noticed, and it moved her more than any plea could have. He had learned at last that begging was a thing he had no right to do. He wrote instead a plain accounting, the kind Corwin would have approved of. He listed what he had done to her, without softening any of it. He named the marble stair. He wrote out the word kennel pup in full, forcing his shaking hand to shape the letters, and beneath it he wrote that it had been the single greatest error of a life full of errors, and that he had spent 40 years understanding it more completely with each passing season. He did not ask for forgiveness. He wrote only that he wanted her to know that the framed charter on his council wall had outlasted every adviser, every treaty, every stone of the kingdom, and that he had instructed his heir to keep it there forever, so that no future king of Marrowgate would ever forget the name of the woman who had saved them, or the reason she had never once had to. At the bottom, in letters so faint she had to tilt the page to the firelight, he had written, "You were never bred for nothing. You were the only true thing in that whole gilded hall, and I could not see it, because I had never learned to see anything I had not been handed. I am glad the mountain saw you clearly. I am glad you turned the chair." Isolde sat with the letter a long time. The fire burned low. She thought she would feel triumph, and she did not. She thought she would feel grief, and she did not feel that either. Not exactly. What she felt, at the very end of it, was something closer to peace, the quiet settling of an account that had been open for 4 decades and could now, finally, be closed. She rose and went to her writing table and took up a pen, and she considered for a long moment what a king who was dying might deserve to hear from the woman he had discarded. She wrote one line. She wrote, "The Charter has fed both our peoples for 40 years. That is a better legacy than the marriage would have been. Rest now. The account is balanced." She sealed it and gave it to the rider at first light and watched him go south into the reddening autumn. And she never learned whether Ardent lived long enough to read it, though the traders said later that the king had died with something like ease, which was more than most proud men managed. Isolde climbed to Corwin's stone that evening, as she always did, and sat with the sound of the works, and she said aloud to the old man who had put a good tool into a good hand, "It's done. All of it. Every ledger closed." The wind moved through the pines. The smelters breathed their smoke into the darkening sky. And Isolde Varn, who had once been called Nothing, sat on her mountain in the last of the light and understood that she had outlived not only her betrayal, but her bitterness, and that this, more than the empire, more than the reversal, more than the turning of any chair, was the thing she had truly built